Everyone. If you're here for the high shear, low cape CSTAR research presentations this morning, again, you're in the right place. This should be a really great conversation this morning. To start it off, we have a couple of speakers this morning from NC State, as well as related research on high shear, low cape convective research and related WRF modeling efforts. So with that said, I'm going to kick it over to Dan Lyons to introduce our speakers this morning. Dan, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Trevor. Appreciate it. So we have, we're really fortunate to work with several folks here at NC State on a lot of different projects, not the least of which is the CSTAR project, where we spent some time looking at high shear, low cape events from a modeling perspective and a model performance perspective. The project's essentially at the finish line here, and it seemed like this would be a great time to summarize some of the findings of this project to a broader audience, maybe not just folks in the Carolinas, but folks that might be interested in high shear, low cape type of research. In this Eastern Region Science Sharing webinar series, it's an excellent way to accomplish that. So Jordan, thank you again for providing us the opportunity and the audience to present to you today. We're going to be hearing from three folks today. We're going to start off with Dr. Gary Lackmann, and then we are going to hear from Trevor Campbell, who is one of the students who is working on this project. If I'm not mistaken, I believe he just defended his thesis yesterday, so he's right at the finish line with some of his work. And then we are going to toss it to Dr. Matt Parker to talk about some of the findings from his group's research. And if we have time at the end, Dr. Parker is also involved in the Perils project. So if we have time and we have a few minutes at the end, he may have some updates on the Perils project, how that's going, so on and so forth. So I am going to share my screen and present some slides. I'm going to present the slides that Dr. Lackmann is going to be speaking to. And with any luck, you should see some slides on the screen. And I guess, Gary, go ahead and take it from there. Just let me know when you need me to change slides.
Okay, yeah, and you'll have to click quickly because I put some slides in there just as sort of references. So we'll go pretty quickly here. I want to make sure to give enough time to Trevor and Matt. Well, the first slide just gives a little bit of an overview of my part of the project. Matt Parker was the lead PI on this, and I played a co-PI role. We had two master's students supported by this and also by teaching assistant funds. So we got a little extra mileage out of the grant that way. Chase Graham defended last year. Now he's at National Weather Service, Louisville, and I'll be presenting his work. We reached out to him. He may be doing shift work or something like that. We didn't. Anyway, I'm summarizing his work very briefly, and then Trevor will talk about his more recent work. We're going to focus on Trevor's work because that hasn't been summarized in previous CSTAR calls and updates. Some challenges that we're facing. I mean, the goal of our part of the project for Chase's thesis was to evaluate the high-resolution ensemble forecast system for severe proxies in high shear, low cape environments. And there's some challenges with this. First of all, the HRF hasn't been around very long. Secondly, it's changed configurations several times during this period. And really, ideally, to evaluate the predictability of something like this, you need a reforecast. We don't have a reforecast. And making a reforecast for a system like the HRF is, I won't say impossible, but I'll say nearly impossible because it's an ensemble of opportunity. You can't, it's, sort of a conglomeration of different forecast systems that are put together. So to go back and do a reforecast would be extremely difficult. So we don't have that luxury. So next slide, please. This is just kind of a title slide for Chase's work. I put the link to his master's thesis at the top there. He defended last May. The thesis includes revisions since the last update that we did. So for further reference, there's the thesis and there's Chase's email. If you go ahead to the next slide, we can get a little bit of background here. There's been a lot of previous work on forecasting convection in high shear, low CAPE environments. And the environmental scale fields developed by Matt and his students, such as Keith Sherburne, have gone a long way towards providing forecasters with valuable information in kind of the day ahead to 2 day ahead lead time on whether environmental conditions will be favorable for high shear, low CAPE severe. But another tool is the convection allowing models that can give you, through proxies, a more explicit forecast rather than just saying the environmental conditions are favorable. It can get down to the sort of proxy for a rotating updraft scale. And so our goal was to assess this and see, can that add value to what the environmental parameters give us? Previous studies have looked at updraft helicity in these type of situations, mainly in high CAPE environments. Here we wanted to look at this for low CAPE environments and high shear, low CAPE environments. So that's a little background. Next slide, please, Dan. So our goals more explicitly are to evaluate the severe proxy skill in the southeastern U.S. for high shear, low CAPE. We also wanted to look at the different thresholds for updraft helicity to see what gives the most skill for high shear, low CAPE convective forecasting. And also there's different ways to calculate the skill. And some of these are very sensitive to the way you calculate them, such as neighborhood size. So we wanted to look at that a little bit. And also one of our other goals that Trevor will speak more to is, what are the kind of characteristic patterns accompanying high shear, low CAPE severe convection? There's some problems, like I mentioned before. One is that we're using local storm reports for verification. There's known issues there. We limited the scope of our study to one severe proxy variable, the ensemble max updraft helicity. We could have looked at more. And then also I mentioned the limitations with the HREF and its configuration changes. Next slide, please. So we have basically data from the model from 2017 on, and Chase defended last year. So we really went through 2021. HREF changed, added the HER member, went from HREF 1 to HREF 2. So we have some variations. The good news is if you look at the skill, we calculated the fraction skill score that I'll talk more about later by year, and it went up each year, which is good for the 3 years that we had data for. Next slide, please. We're very grateful to the Storm Prediction Center, especially Brett Roberts and Adam Clark and the NSSL IT folks for setting up a thread server that has all the HREF runs. This was an incredibly valuable resource. We've actually been using it in other studies too. Jacob Radford, who's studying mesoscale snow bands, has also been using this data source. So it's great to have it out there. A reforecast would be nice, but since we can't have one, it's a really nice data set to have to work with. So shout out to SPC for that. And next slide. I have a series of slides here that will just talk about some of the methods we used. I'm assuming most people on this call are familiar with updraft helicity. We're using the 0 to 3 kilometer maximum updraft helicity from the ensemble. And so we can skip ahead to the next one, please, Dan. For the observations, we know there's limitations with using local storm reports. And we excluded hail and just looked at tornadoes and winds. And we aggregated over 6-hour windows and then used the same blocks of time for the model forecasts and interpolated the storm reports to the model grid using a nearest neighbor approach. So that's the model and the observational data. We calculated a number of different skill metrics, the fraction skill score being the main one. So that this is a score that's based on binary fields. And so we basically used the updraft helicity threshold and the local storm report to binarize the fields and calculate the fraction skill score. That's been used a fair bit in severe convection verification studies. So then next slide. one of the CSTAR update calls, the Storm Prediction Center folks suggested doing a LSR weighting of the fraction skill score. So, you weight the fraction skill score by the number of LSRs in a given event. And so Chase did this, and that has a pretty big effect on the score. We looked also at kind of contingency table statistics like probability of detection, success ratio, critical success index, and we'll look at those in the form of a performance diagram as well. So this is all background. I don't want to bog down in the details, so let's go ahead to the results. I guess I have a couple, a little bit more about the contingency table. This is probably familiar to most of you, but there it is for reference. And then the next slide shows the performance diagram from Rober 2009. So on this diagram, the vertical axis is probability of detection, and the abscissa is the success ratio, which is 1 minus the false alarm ratio. So it's a very useful diagram because the solid curves that are on there are a valid measure of skill. So you want to be in the upper right portion of this diagram for the highest skill. And then when you get down to the lower left portion, there's very little skill. So if we go to the next slide, showing some of the results. So each one of these dots is one of our 6-hour window events, and the little dots, that is. And at the bottom, you can see that there are different updraft helicity thresholds, 25 meters squared per second squared up through 75. And you'll see that there's more of the little red dots clustered up near the top, which means that there's a very high probability of detection, but it's also over forecasting. And if you go down to the bottom, you see more of the yellows and greens, meaning that those higher updraft helicity thresholds have a much lower probability of detection and are under forecasting. So you really want to be along that 45-degree line. And if you hit the advance button, it should add that line, and then hit it again, and it should indicate the average, when you average over all the cases for the unweighted, so the non-LSR weighted values, and that there are larger dots there. Those are really low skill values compared to other forecast parameters. So it's not great, but you see that there's a slight advantage to the 35 and 50 meters squared per second squared in terms of skill. If we use the weighted means, which is if you advance again, Dan, you see that when you weight the scores by the number of LSRs, the skill goes up considerably. And that indicates that the more active events are better forecast. Of course, forecasters don't know ahead of time whether an event is going to be active or not. But there is that good bit of good news there that you get higher skill. Also, when you look at the critical success index, the 25 and 35 meters squared per second squared are the two highest skill thresholds when you use the weighted, the LSR weighted mean. So next slide, this shows that for the unweighted and the weighted. This may be helpful in terms of which thresholds to look at when you have an unfolding event. We also looked at a lot of cases that had high and low skill. In the interest of time, I don't think I'll show those, but this shows kind of what the skill values are. But overall, the skill is quite low. And I guess that's not a huge surprise given the challenge of day-ahead prediction of this type of low instability convection. So next slide should be our conclusions. So for maximum updraft helicity, we saw a large variability in skill. Some events had very high skill. Often these were kind of the strong squall line type cases for wind reports. In general, overall, updraft helicity skill was maximized for thresholds of 25 to 35 meters squared per second squared. So it's good that SBC plots those low thresholds for the href. Again, the LSR weighting improved the skill, which suggests that higher activity events are better forecasted. And the href database is a really nice database for studying predictability, but this is a problem with ensembles of opportunity. You can't really do a reforecast, so getting a handle on the model climate is very difficult, and that limited our ability to really draw conclusions because of the small sample size that it left us with. So that's a very quick summary of Chase's work, and I'll take questions if we have a minute or two for that, and then turn it over to Trevor. Or if there's no questions, we'll just turn it straight over to Trevor. That's fine.
All right, so just go ahead and roll into mine then, or?
Yeah, why don't you?
Yeah, we can have questions for the end. That works.
Okay.
All right, so let me get set up. All right, everything look good on everyone else's end?
I can see it. All good.
All right. So I'm going to be giving a brief summary on my master's defense work, which was using self-organizing maps for classifying the variability in southeastern United States high shear low cape environments. Gary did a good job at setting the table of previous high shear low cape work and going over Chase's study. But just to briefly say, prior to this specific CSTAR grant, a lot of work has been done to assess the overall environment and ingredients associated with high shear low cape convection, including the processes that are involved in rapid destabilization that provides ample convective ingredients for these environments. And like Gary mentioned, there was overall, on average, low forecast skill in the updraft helicity proxy, and given the limited extent of href implementation, to assess the overall impact of events or assessing the skill of different variables of events in high shear low cape environments, we were looking for a greater length of time to assess these environments in. And we had motivation from some previous studies that used objective classification techniques of near storm tornadic environments in tornado outbreaks by Anderson Frey et al. 2019. So given all the variables that I laid out, this motivated the scientific questions that were used in my defense, looking at the patterns associated with southeastern United States high shear low cape convection. But for the sake of today's study, the focus will be mainly on points 2 and 3, where we're seeing if there are variations in the distribution of severe weather occurrence in association with the environmental patterns associated with high shear low cape convection, and seeing if there are environmental patterns that are prevalent in higher impact events than lower impact events when we're assessing impact using the occurrence of local storm reports. And although I don't go into great detail today about looking at the patterns in association with some of the composite parameters that were developed previously, like the SHRB and the MOSH, I will include one point at the end, just discussing that briefly. So just to briefly go over how the database of high shear low cape events was created, similar to Chase Graham's work, I used an automatic classification technique to classify 6-hour windows as severe events, similar to what Chase Graham did. And this was over a period of 13 cool seasons from 2009 to 2021. And that was assisted by both Keith Sherburne and Chase Graham in order to make sure that this automated classification technique was accurate. And essentially just using this southeastern United States domain to assess if tornado or wind reports occurred, hail reports were excluded, and then assessing the environment around each of the storm reports to make sure that it meets the high shear low cape criteria. And the data we grabbed for this was a 20-kilometer rapid refresh and rapid update cycle analysis. And based off of suggestions from a previous CSTAR call, the focus on the patterns for this is in an event relative format. So I'll be looking at a 2,000 by 2,000 kilometer domain that's centered over the average latitude longitude for the severe reports for a given event, just to try to assess the patterns in that event relative framework. And in addition, the data was obtained for the window onset time to view it as a forecaster would for that period extending from the beginning. And I want to briefly touch on this objective classification technique that we used, which was self-organizing maps. It's a machine learning technique that basically serves as a clustering method where you have a set of nodes that are defined by the user, the numbers defined by the user, which will represent the amount of environmental patterns you want to define. And over the process of training the self-organizing map using weighted distance calculations to see which data is best matching to a given node, we have this classification process that ensues. And over the process of many iterations, these nodes begin to take the shape of the data. And what that looks like in a more meteorological sense is this clustering that occurs where over a number of iterations, we have sea level pressure patterns here. We can see that as the SOM training process continues, we get this organization of similar sea level pressure patterns, as we can see by the separation of similar types of cases, strong surface cyclones in the top left, weaker in the bottom right. And that's essentially how self-organizing maps works for this study. And the data that's being used, I don't have time to go over everything in depth today, but I'll show what the different training variables that I used for self-organizing maps was. This is the extensive list of variables, and just an important reminder too is that SOM output is the list of events, because that's our data in this sense, that are assigned to a winning node. So when we have that list of events for a given node or each best matching node, we can look at all the variables associated with that. But today we'll just be looking at some sample output. So I'll start by looking at a sea level pressure trained SOM, and we chose 16 nodes for this study to classify the patterns. And we can see that there's a general organization of these patterns along the axes, and then when overlaid with local storm report density, we can see where the severe weather occurrence was in association with these patterns. And we can see a more eastward located surface cyclone on the left-hand side, on the left-hand column, transitioning to more westward located surface cyclones on the right-hand side. And on the y-axis, we have increasing intensity of the surface cyclone for a given pattern as we decrease downward. Additionally, too, we can see that the orientation of local storm reports across all of these nodes is confined to locations of an implied surface cold front where we have this pressure trough, and that's the same across all nodes. But this is a overwhelming amount of data to digest all at once. So transitioning to just looking at the corner nodes, because those demonstrate the patterns with the greatest variability. We can still see we have the same organization process from more eastward to westward located cyclones, in addition to increasing intensity along the y-axis. And here I've annotated the average number of LSRs per case for all the cases within a given node. And we can see these general trends of higher number of storm reports with more westward cyclones and only slightly more average LSRs with increasing intensity. But looking at the average storm reports alone is only can tell so much. So what we did was creating histograms of all of the distribution of storm reports for a given case within the nodes. And high impact outlier events were excluded in these, as you can see, a cutoff of 100. There are events with greater than 100 LSRs for a given 6-hour window. But the focus of this is we can see this trend that LSRs per case are skewed to lower LSRs. The 0 to 10 LSR bin is the most populated bin in every single node. And if you were to use just general trends, again, the median and the means for these nodes are slightly higher in the more westward and stronger surface cyclone patterns. But again, this trend was prevalent in not just sea level pressure SOM, all the variables that we trained had a similar output of this histogram. The patterns varied between nodes, and we were able to see some slight differences based off of the previous work that's been done to analyze these environments. However, all of the output looked pretty similar. And for the sake of time, I won't go through each of the other individual SOMs that showed similar results for the distribution of severe reports within nodes. But this motivated seeing that no one individual variable was able to distinguish severe weather occurrence amongst the patterns within it. This motivated training a different set of data. Actually, I have one more slide right here, is taking the corner node again to show the most distinct patterns. And I verified that these general trends were true, given the previously documented and what Gary said, the limitations of storm reports. I used just tornado-only storm reports too, just to make sure that there weren't any biases due to wind reports and tornado being a little bit more objective. But again, we can see, obviously there's much fewer tornado reports for given cases, and that skew towards fewer reports is still present amongst nodes of different sea level pressure patterns. And there's a slight increase in the mean median and the stronger surface cyclone or more westward cyclone, but like this pattern along with all the other variables was true. So going back to what I was previously saying, this motivated there being no trend when just training on an individual variable across the entire data set. This motivated looking at the upper quartile and lower quartile of storm reports in a given for the entire data set. So we defined the upper quartile as high shear locate severe events where there were 36 or more storm reports, and lower quartile with 3 or fewer LSRs for a given 6-hour window. And we compared, again, all of the variables that were outlined. But for the sake of today, I'll show a few examples of the most drastic patterns. So these SOMs were trained on the 9-node. This was a 9-node self-organizing map, but I'm just using the corner nodes again to display the most distinct patterns. And some of the ingredients that were shown to be most impactful in demonstrating high shear locate severe convection in previous studies, and one of which is 0 to 1 kilometer vertical wind shear. And comparing the most distinct patterns, we can see that there's strong 0 to 1 kilometer wind shear in all these nodes. The weakest nodes between the quartiles still are demonstrating at least some extent of a composite of 20 knots or greater 0 to 1 kilometer wind shear, and some demonstrating very strong wind shear. But comparing the two against each other, if we compute the area in which a given threshold is met, so if we use a 20-knot threshold, comparing the upper quartile to the lower quartile shows only a 9% greater area of shear greater than 20 knots on average in this upper quartile. And when we compare that to another convective ingredient, this is our version of creating a variable designed to represent the release of potential instability. We use the 700 minus 1000 heptapascal theta E difference is our theta E lapse rate, and that's overlaid with 500 heptapascal upward vertical velocity to represent the release of potential instability. And in the shaded regions, we use the threshold of 3 negative microbars per second as a vertical motion threshold. And if that vertical motion was in a region of negative theta E difference, that region was shaded. And we can see that in the upper quartile, these higher impact events, there's a greater region of processes representing the release of potential instability. And to quantify that, there's actually a 209% greater area of potential instability release as we defined it in this study on average. So the slight distinction that one particular pattern is a bit more prevalent in higher impact events. And finally, I said I would touch on the MOSH real quick. When using self-organizing maps, these are most effective in using continuous fields. MOSH is a discrete, discontinuous field, very centered on the location of where severe activity is. So even despite using an event relative framework, slight spatial distributions in the marsh can result in overall smoothing. And when we compare look at the upper quartile, we can see that in this node, we have instance of low mosh on average, but due to some composite smoothing and given the error that's involved in self-organizing maps using this field, we have some area where there's lower mosh values. And on average, there is a greater area of mosh. We use the threshold for mosh depicting significant severe convection is 1, but because of composite smoothing, I just used 0.5, and for a given threshold, the percentages were generally the same. There is more mosh in the higher impact nodes, which is what it was designed to do. It was designed to show significant severe convection. But we do have instances of lower mosh values in these high impact nodes, in addition to having some high mosh values in the lower quartile. This was more due to the event identification process. If there was a spatial or temporal boundary where an event occurred just on the other side of it in an environment, or just before it in an environment that was still conducive to severe convection, but because of the cutoff point, that's more the reason for these higher values. But that's just a quick summary of looking at mosh. I'd be happy to take any questions on any variable in particular afterwards, but to summarize real quick, no one variable demonstrates significant differences in severe weather occurrence across these patterns. However, when we separated it into LSR quartiles, the processes representing potential instability release found to be most distinct when we compare these activity levels. And in addition, I didn't put this point on, but it's important to note, kind of similar to what Gary said, if forecasters don't know what the extent of event impact is going to be prior to the event occurring. So MOSH is self-described as being most useful in a significant severe framework, but there is some indication that some of these lower impact events are showing lower values of MOSH on average. So other convective parameters obviously need to be examined outside of that too. And I include some areas for future work that we could implement more of a skill-based analysis if there's a particular skill associated with environmental pattern. If there were a greater period of time where a forecast skill analysis could be done, we could use those patterns there. But outside of that, that's what I have for today. And I guess we'll send it over to Matt.
Thanks. Let's see. Am I sharing?
Yep, looks good.
Great. Yeah, I'll go pretty quickly through this since we're getting a bit late in the hour. But this is the work of 2 students, Andy Wade and Levi Lovell. And this part of the proposal really focused a bit more on processes and dynamics in high shear, low cape environments. The details of both of these studies are published now, so you can find them. This is some of the highlights from Andy Wade's paper that was in Journal of Atmospheric Science on high shear, low cape supercells. And the motivation for this project came from Vortex Southeast, which was a field campaign that we participated in. This particular event on 31 March 2016, there's a widespread area of convective precipitation, which is fairly common for these high shear, low cape events, some embedded supercells and a number of tornadoes represented by those black triangles. And we're kind of focusing on this corridor here in western through northern Alabama in particular. Here's a number of the soundings that were made on this particular day. And a couple things jump out at you. First, that the cape is rather low, whether you like mixed layer or surface-based cape, well below 1,000 joules per kilogram, which your eyes can see with the partial curves on the QTs. The other thing that's really notable is the strong low-level shear. Generally at 900 millibars, we've got between 30 and 45 knots. And that translates into really large near-ground storm relative helicity. So by the last sounding shown here in the lower right, which was taken in fairly close proximity to a tornado, the 0 to 500 meter storm relative helicity over 300 meters squared per second squared. So these are really large low-level shear environments with limited CAPE. And really what Andy wanted to do is do kind of an apples to apples comparison of the dynamics of storms simulated in those low CAPE environments compared to a southeastern environment from a high CAPE case. And he ended up using this sounding from the super outbreak in 1974 as his sort of control for high CAPE environments. And so the approach was to do idealized simulations with 100 meter grid spacing. So these aren't quite tornado resolving, but they get a lot of the details leading up to tornado genesis in a fairly faithful way. And one of the things that's kind of striking here, so the high CAPE case is in the upper left, and then 3 of those low CAPE soundings are the remainders of the panels. We're looking at low-level reflectivity and low-level updraft helicity. One thing I found kind of striking is that the horizontal structures and low-level updrafts of the storms are actually rather similar when we look in the lower troposphere. Where we started to see more distinctive differences is when we started to look at the vertical structures. And so not surprisingly, the high CAPE storms have very deep updrafts. The cloud top height is up at the level of the tropopause or even a bit above that. That's what's being shaded in gray. And the teal field represents the updraft greater than 15 meters per second. And what we find is that the updrafts extend all the way up into the upper troposphere. And importantly, they're rather vertically oriented and they're rather contiguous or coherent from the surface all the way up into the upper troposphere. So this is kind of a garden variety high CAPE supercell storm in many respects. When you look at the low CAPE storms, these storms tend to be much shallower, which is probably not surprising. They tend to be much more elongated in the down shear direction, which is also probably not surprising. And one of the most distinctive things is in terms of the updraft structure. These updrafts are strongly maximized in the lower troposphere, in the lowest maybe 3 or 4 kilometers. And you don't see much teal above maybe 4 kilometers above ground level here. The middle and upper troposphere are characterized by rather weak vertical motions. And what vertical motions you find are often found quite some distance down shear of the low-level updraft. And so we wanted to understand the extent to which this might impact the potential to produce tornadoes and also whether this changes the sort of dynamical processes that lead to those tornadoes. So this is a time height cross-section of vertical vorticity. And what Andy found was that each of these simulations produced a tornado-like vortex. You can see these sort of maxima in the vertical vorticity field that fill the lowest, say, 1 kilometer or so. The high CAPE run here in the upper left produces a stronger and longer-lived tornado-like vortex, but there are tornado-like vortices in all 4 of these simulations. And that's really what he wanted to focus his analysis on. So I had to kind of pick and choose here, but maybe one of the most interesting things is to just look at the trajectories of the air parcels that are flowing through these tornado-like vortices. And in the high CAPE case, you find the air parcels flow in through the forward flank of a supercell. They accelerate upward into the updraft. This is where that intense stretching is both forming and maintaining the tornado. And then ultimately, these parcels continue to be a part of the updraft throughout the middle and upper troposphere. Some of them make it essentially all the way up to the equilibrium levels. This is a very deep column of stretching that's present. If you look at the trajectories in the low CAPE simulations, the sort of common theme is that the parcels flow in through the forward flank, much like in the high CAPE storms. They erupt upward into the vortex, but they're only ascending a couple of kilometers before they sort of slow down and stagnate. And ultimately, they sort of depart what we might think of as the main updraft and don't continue to accelerate upward through the middle and upper troposphere. And Andy has some pretty extravagant figures to sort of get through the dynamics of this. I tried to boil it down to a simple schematic here. And the sort of baseline here is that both the high CAPE and low CAPE storms have intense low-level mesocyclones. That's the low-level rotation in the updraft. And associated with that intense rotation, there's lowered pressure. This is the dynamical pressure response to rotation. You could think of this as like cyclostrophic balance, if you like. And as you lower the pressure aloft in the mesocyclone, that drives an upward dynamic pressure gradient acceleration. We're below the level of free convection here, so all of the upward accelerations are being driven by this dynamic effect of the rotation aloft. The air isn't yet positively buoyant. And so a lot of that upward acceleration that produces the stretching to make the tornado is happening near the ground as a consequence of this. But it actually comes with a penalty. Once you get above that minimum in pressure, in other words, above the low-level mesocyclone, there's a corresponding downward acceleration due to the dynamic pressure gradient. And the problem is that air parcels start slowing down before they get to the level of free convection where they become positively buoyant. In the high Cape case, this isn't such a problem because in high Cape environments, parcels acquire positive buoyancy very rapidly above the level of free convection. And so it turns out in the high Cape simulation, the maximum in vertical velocity is in the middle or upper troposphere, and most of that vertical motion comes from the buoyancy above the level of free convection. In contrast, the low Cape trajectories look very different. They're sort of departing the updraft at low altitudes, and the reason is that essentially that hindrance from downward acceleration associated with the dynamic pressure gradient field brings the parcels almost to a stop before they get to the level of free convection, and they don't acquire positive buoyancy rapidly enough to offset that in the low Cape environments. And so all the action is below the level of free convection, and the peak in vertical velocity in the low Cape storms is in the lowest 1 to 2 kilometers above the ground. Almost none of that comes from buoyancy. I'm going to just kind of breeze through this, but it also turns out the cold pools are rather weak in the low Cape storms. And this has some potentially interesting implications for tornado production. We generally think that outflows that are less cold are more favorable for tornado production. But we also think that a lot of horizontal vorticity is created from cold pools in the forward flank of supercells. What this may mean is that these high shear low Cape environments are kind of special, because they're getting a lot more ambient vorticity. The storm relative helicity is off the charts. And so maybe the storm doesn't have to sort of bootstrap its own additional horizontal vorticity in the forward flank. And this is just sort of some observations from that case showing that the observed cold pools are similarly quite weak. So yeah, the take-home message here is that a lot of the action is shallower in the low Cape storms, and it's not really driven by buoyancy. There are these intense low-level updrafts. They can still support tornadogenesis, but everything that's happening is shallower. And the take-home message for forecasting or for warning operations is that you really need to depict the processes near the ground well, because what you're seeing in the middle and upper troposphere on the higher scans just isn't all that closely related to what's happening in the tornadogenesis process of the low Cape storms. Okay, thanks. Looks like Jeff threw the citation in there as well. The second study also I'm going to try to go through quickly, but you can get the details from this publication that's just come out in the last few months. This is Levi Lovell's work on QLCS tornado-like vortices in high shear low Cape environments. And he focused on this interesting event from February 2018, where there was a period of time where the convective system produced some severe winds, but no tornadoes. And then we had a sort of shift to a regime in which quite a large number of tornadoes occurred. And he wanted to try to understand what was different between the non-tornadic and the tornadic phases of this QLCS. And so this is what the observed reflectivity looked like. And we're looking at the tracks of the observed tornadoes here in the lower left. He performed a high resolution simulation with the WRF model. And what we're seeing down here in the lower right are the simulated tracks of vortices produced by the WRF model there in the sort of mid-Mississippi Valley. What Levi really focused on were the kind of details of the vortices themselves. He treated the simulation as a sort of proxy data set within which he could get a population of vortices and then look at the details of those vortices, because we know these are really difficult to observe well. And so we're looking at the distribution of near surface wind speeds in the model, and you can see some of these were quite intense, although the median vortex is not all that strong. There are a few that reached EF2 intensity. Most of them are short-lived, but a few could live as long as 15 to 20 minutes. And most of these are rather shallow, although a few of them exceeded 3 kilometers in depth. And he wanted to try to identify what were some of the properties of the stronger, deeper, longer-lived vortices. One of the things that's maybe in our favor here is that it turns out the most intense vortices are generally going to be the most detectable. They're longer lived. They have greater depth. And so you're getting more scans and you're getting better depictions farther from the radar. And they also tend to, by virtue of living longer, have longer path lengths as well. And these plots just sort of show the correlations between vortex intensity, vortex depth, vortex path length, and duration isn't on here, but it would look very similar. To sort of tie things back to our operational interests, we wanted to figure out if there were any sort of, reflectivity signatures that were very reliably indicating the presence of these intense vortices. What he found is that reflectivity, there's not a one-size-fits-all pattern that always indicates the presence of a vortex. Sometimes we just had these subtle gust front cusps that were present. Sometimes there were embedded supercell-like structures, including kind of coherent updrafts with hook echoes. Sometimes we would get these kind of line breaks, what I know in the Weather Service people have called the broken S reflectivity evolution. And sometimes the reflectivity didn't have much structure to it at all. And maybe what was sort of frustrating is that he made a data set of null events as well, where the rotation was just below sort of damage scale, and found that the reflectivity structures just weren't all that different. In other words, it wasn't quite so simple as just look for this pattern and you can reliably presume that an intense vortex is present. He wanted to figure out whether maybe there were some environmental cues. And so he took environmental profiles from the model immediately ahead of the intense vortices and compared those to the non-tornadic vortices. And maybe there are some subtle differences in 0 to 3 kilometer CAPE focused in the lower troposphere, low-level lapse rates, low-level shear, that's the BWD is bulk wind difference, and 0 to 6 kilometer shear as well. These are statistically significant differences. The problem is those differences are quite small. And so from a practical perspective, it's hard to tell someone, well, the difference between 32 and 34 meters per second is a meaningful difference that has practical applicability. So while the differences were there and they actually showed up as somewhat meaningful in some idealized simulations he tried, it's hard to hang your hat on differences that are that small quantitatively. He also looked at the significant tornado parameter, and that parameter actually was a bit lower in front of the tornadic vortices. So there's just not a whole lot to hang your hat on in terms of, if you were to look at the SPC mesoanalysis, here's a clear-cut way of discriminating which parts of a QLCS are going to be tornadic versus non-tornadic. Maybe the most useful thing that came out of this was that there were parts of the convective line that would bow or kind of bulge forward. And as they did, faces of the outflow would become more nearly perpendicular to the low-level shear. So the barbs here are the low-level shear vectors, 0 to 3 kilometer shear. And when you would get these more nearly perpendicular faces to the outflow, that often was a location where low-level vortices would develop and become more intense. And this is sort of part and parcel of what people are doing when they're using the 3-ingredient method, is looking for those places where bowing or bulging of the line enhances that line perpendicular shear. So that did seem to shake out as a useful approach and a useful thing to monitor when you have these high shear low CAPE QLCSs. Probably the most impressive thing that we could find to hang our hats on is just the structure of the low-level updraft and vorticity fields. So what you're seeing here is vertical vorticity in a cross-section that's shaded, and updraft is contoured, and then the velocity vectors are on there. And so the take-home message is that in the non-tornadic case, you have an intense updraft and you have vertical vorticity, but it's really found farther aloft in the mid-levels. It's not really present in the lowest 1 kilometer, which is where we really want the superposition of updraft and vertical vorticity to produce intense stretching that creates a tornado-like vortex. In comparison, when we look at the tornado-like vortices, the updraft is intense much closer to the surface, and the vertical vorticity is also intense much closer to the surface. So what this tells us is, unfortunately, if your radar beam is overshooting the lowest, maybe 500 to 1,000 meters, you're kind of missing the part of the QLCS that really is discriminatory between the tornadic and non-tornadic vortices. This might look great on your base scan if your base scan is a kilometer above the ground. So it's just an argument to keep scanning at the lowest altitudes we can and to scan as often as we can. So using sails, mesosails, and getting that 0.2 degree scan are probably the most beneficial things you can do to try to discriminate the tornadic from the non-tornadic centers of circulation. So again, the highlights here, a lot of these vortices in QLCSs and high shear low CAPE environments tend to be rather weak. You want to try to pick out the ones that are longer lived. Those tend to be stronger, deeper, and longer lived. So detection is at least possible. And we really focused on not so much the reflectivity patterns as the fact that near the ground, you do have some skill if you can depict the low-level updraft and the low-level vertical vorticity, maybe in the lowest 500 to 1,000 meters. That seemed to be the most obvious difference between the tornadic and the non-tornadic vortices in these simulations. So stop there and refer you to those journal articles if you want to get more details, and hopefully there's a little time for questions.
All right, Matthew, Dr. Parker, thank you so much. Dr. Lackmann and Trevor, thank you for your collective presentations. A lot of really great information shared this morning. A lot of great insights for the field as well on this research and these important topics. Just a note to everyone, this is being recorded. I see some comments in the chat. It's being recorded and will be uploaded. Actually, I'm going to share a link here to where it will be found afterwards on our Eastern Region SSD Google Science Sharing page. At this point, I'll ask if there are any questions from anyone about any of the topics presented on today. We have a few minutes and we can go longer as needed. Seeing some kudos coming in. I guess I'll start with Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe a bit of a question for Matt, kind of, getting at your last point, looking forward to improving warning processes. Obviously, real-time high-resolution modeling is one option, but from a detection, given the radar limitations, you're not really close to the radar, or even if you have, really close to the radar, does this really kind of scream the need for more of either dual Doppler or shall we say multiple radar process? You need multiple radars that are also both scanning, in the lowest couple thousand feet from a detection standpoint. Kind of present a challenge, but also maybe highlights the benefit or need for some of these maybe lower cost expand, CASA type of systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think dual Doppler in real time is a beautiful dream. I think we can depict the rotation pretty well. The structure of the updraft is more difficult to depict, obviously. Maybe if your beam height is quite low, you can see a convergence signature, and maybe someone could work out a way to sort of quantify, how much low-level radial convergence is associated with the high-end updrafts. But yeah, I mean, if I had a blank check, first, double or triple the number of radars, and then, yeah, let's figure out a way to have three-dimensional winds in the low levels in real time. It's a tough problem because those X-band radars attenuate really badly in heavy precipitation, and yeah, I mean, I feel for you guys because you know what information you need, and it's not easy information to get, I think.
Thanks.
So kind of a broader question from my end. This is to all three presenters. A lot of great findings presented today, a lot of great information. And I understand, CSTAR projects have a start, a middle, and an end to them. I understand that. But where are the main findings being taken? Like, where is upcoming work being focused on from what has been presented? Like, what are the priority goals, if you say, for future upcoming work on this?
Well, I'll chime in, and Matt is the papers that he showed have been published, and so those are great resources. I'll be working with Trevor. Trevor will be hitting the job market here, but I'm really hoping that we can get a journal paper out that really tries to hone in on the operational aspects of his work. And so that's our next step, is to try to get a journal paper out presenting that. And I don't know if we can, with Chase's work, his thesis is out there. The sample size issue is going to make it difficult to publish that, I believe. So we'll be focusing on Trevor's work in the near term. But the grant is over, so we've gotten a lot of mileage out of this, as Matt can attest. This is a 3-year project over a 5-year time period. We kept doing no-cost extensions, partly because of the pandemic, and also we were a little late getting started with the recruiting cycle. But we still have time to publish these latest findings.
Awesome, thank you. Also, I'd be remiss to say congrats, Trevor, on your defense as well. Before the hour's out. Are there any other questions for anyone in the field at all? If not, and just some more comments come in. Yeah, no, it's just really great to see how all this is being applied. No doubt about it. If there are no other questions, as I mentioned, this is being recorded, so we'll have it uploaded to our Google site later today. Again, a big thank you, Dr. Lackmann, Dr. Parker, and Trevor. Again, congrats.
Jordan, I don't know if there's a little time if Matt wanted to say a little something about.
Oh, right, about the Perils work. If there's, yeah, sure.
Yeah, I have some slides, but I don't know that I want to. Slides will make me talk slower. But yeah, so maybe the next steps from my group are involving this Perils project. That's propagation, evolution, and rotation in linear storms. This is a joint project between NSF and NOAA. And we're focused in sort of the greater lower Mississippi Valley area. So the goal is specifically to understand the environments and the within storm details of QLCSs that are producing tornadoes and other fine scale vortices. And so this year we had 4 observing periods, 3 in the kind of greater Alabama, Mississippi area, and then 1 that was up in the boot heel of Missouri. There were tornadoes within our network in all 4 cases. And at this point, the data aren't even completely quality controlled, but we're already in my group starting to play around with looking at the cold pools, how strong they are, whether there are any important differences between the parts of convective lines that are tornadic versus non-tornadic. And we're going out again next year, and the goal for next year is 8 cases, 8 observing periods. And so That'll span from early February to early May of next year. And kind of stay dialed into the forecasts, because almost anytime there's a chance of a QLCS in the lower Mississippi Valley, we'll be out there.
And I'd like to add to that. I was on a call earlier this week with my other regional counterparts with NSSL, and we're kind of working on a plan to engage some to engage forecasters where they can go out in the post-storm survey activities. There's a lot of work being done with UASs, as as part of the storm assessment activities. And so there's a lot of interest in having Weather Service folks participate with that as time allows. Again, that travel will be funded as part of the grant. But we're kind of trying to figure out how to logistically do this. Probably what will happen is we will identify kind of a cadre of interested folks, and in the lead up to an event, there'll probably be some sort of a call for possible participants. I think understood from an Eastern region standpoint, the challenge may be that today's perils field work is tomorrow's Eastern region severe weather event. So it may be difficult for our.
In fact, our travel home from one of our IOPs, a tornado happened almost right at Raleigh Durham Airport while we were traveling back.
But stay tuned for more information. It's kind of we figured this out. This idea kind of popped up during the project this year. And we kind of realized there wasn't time to get our act together for this past spring. But we're kind of starting the activities now so that as we get to next year, we'll kind of have a method, figure out how to do this. But it's an opportunity both for interaction, but also to get to see some of the new technologies that are being developed, things like utilizing UASs for storm surveys. Weather Service folks won't be expected to operate the UAS, so that's not an issue. But there may be some training on that as well. Eric, there's a lot of requirements in operating UASs. There's a lot of legal stuff and working with the FAA, and it's kind of not like flying a small drone in your backyard. It'll be an interesting opportunity, and stay tuned for more information about that.
All right. Thank you, Jeff, for that add-on. Appreciate it. And thank you, Matt. So on those final notes, I guess I'll offer if there are any final questions about what was just discussed at the back end of this conversation, or any of the topics discussed during our presentation during the heart of the previous hour. Okay.
I'll just say thank you for allowing us the opportunity to share this, and thank you for being here. And if any questions come up later, feel free to email.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much to all of our presenters, and thank you to our audience as well for attending, and wishing you a great rest of your Thursday afternoon, hopefully a quiet one, hopefully.